Top of the morning, everyone. My name is Tshidi and I'm back with another video. Today's video is, what do employers ask when they call your references? This is one of those things where today's video is trying to give you a bit of insight as to why we normally want to understand or to call some of your previous employers, to understand some of the things that you have done. There are quite a number of benefits to this. So for a lot of people, they always look at references being called as a very negative thing. It's not a negative thing. In most cases, actually a very, very positive things. But here's a question that I want to lead with. Are references still relevant in 2022, 23, or in the future of work, or in the way that we're actually going to work going forward? And the reason I ask that question is because if you look at the way we used to work in the past, where we definitely used to see each other on a daily basis. Now companies are going hybrid. Some of them are going completely remote. How well do you really know the people that you work with if you were to actually give a reference based on that? And then secondly, because references are normally individuals that we either allocate or select or identify and say, you can call X, Y, Z. Are they the most honest individuals that we actually are looking at? Those are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves in the world of recruitment. However, today's video is definitely not about that. It is to make sure that everybody understands what we normally do ask, or what we normally do check when we actually call some of your references that you have presented to us, to say, these are the top 3 or top 2 people that you can actually call to understand my output and my work. When we do call these references, what do we normally find out? There's a few things that we normally do check. Number one is to obviously check what the relationship between yourself and the person that we're actually calling is. Whether your manager, was it a colleague, was it a supervisor, what was it? Like what role do they play in your career? Is it a relationship where we're able to get whether they actually could have an input in your development? Or is it where we actually talk more about relationship side? Because depending on who we then speak to, the questions will then basically change. So the first one that we normally check, for example, is, did you actually do what the person said they did? In some instances, you'll find that some people end up putting information that's not necessarily there, or they plagiarize some of the information, and then it ends up just not being necessarily correct. So did you actually do what you said you did? And then were you also there at the time that you said you were there? Because in some instances, like I said, people change careers and they end up, not necessarily telling the truth about where they were. Not necessarily. So for now, this might sound a bit negative, but there are some reference or some points that we do check that are also very, very valuable and that could actually help you as a candidate. For example, do people actually like working with you? In some instances, you'll find that a lot of people don't like speaking about who they are and what people think about them or what people say about them. So in some instances, these references where we actually call these people, we're able to then check if people actually enjoy working with you. In most cases, you'll find that people actually did have a blast actually working with you. How do you approach the work that you actually are given? How's the attitude like? That's one of those important things in the last video that I actually did, where I said, what do we normally look for in the questions that we ask the candidates? Now, this then gives you an example of what do we look for in the questions that we ask your referees, the people that we will call to say, do you know Tshidi and do you know anything about his work? How did he deliver some of that work? Strengths and weaknesses from the reference point of view. There is this thing that a lot of people don't normally speak about called the imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is where sometimes people tell you that you are good, but you're always doubting if you're as good as everybody says you are. And from a reference point of view, they're sometimes in a position to be able to share some of the best strengths about you, some of the weaknesses that you might have that will actually still not necessarily be a negative thing in your career going forward, and we're able to then guide you and assist you with that. And in most cases, you'll find that references are also used by most companies as a development plan. They can be used as that, because one of the questions that we actually do ask sometimes is, where might this individual improve? Because we want to check, is there something that we need to work on when we actually assist them, or where in particular you're outstanding in certain areas. Once again, these are questions that are asked depending on the relationship and depending on the seniority of the role. So you can't just ask the same type of questions for each one of those, for whatever level it is. You have to ask it based on the seniority of the different role. The stress levels, how does this person deal with stress? Is this the person that's gonna start throwing things around? Is this the person that's gonna start not being, cooperative, or do they sulk? Do they do this? And then how do they handle criticism? Those are some of the questions that we then try to find out from the person on the other side, to see how do you normally deal with criticism if you're given that criticism when the time comes. And what is also very beautiful is questions about what is your most memorable accomplishments. As I mentioned, a lot of people tend to not really like speaking about themselves. And questions like this, what is your biggest accomplishment, are absolutely beautiful, because then people can speak about some of your biggest achievements that you might not necessarily have mentioned in your conversation. Why did they leave the job? And this one, you'll see some of the things that I'll cover a bit later in this same video, where some people have been dismissed, or some people left because of so many different things, and people gave different reasons why they left. And if it was, for example, I used to work for a bank. If it was a dismissal that was based on anything to do with fraud, money, anything to do with that, it becomes very difficult for other banks to actually employ you. And that's why in some instances, it's actually very, very important to check some of these things, because if it was some of those where it actually wasn't a very good thing, or you left the company, you put the company in disrepute, or you've done something that wasn't really palatable to the world, you need to actually sometimes be careful. That's why social media is extremely important when it comes to how we actually use social media. And then the other thing that we then have is, what about this new job? Do you think that this person will be better at, or what that you think they'll actually be able to do? Because what we sometimes do is we also tell them what the role is, so that we hear what their views are and what they think about that particular role. And then what might be a stretch project for this individual. What do you think we could do to potentially stretch this person to be able to, come to the most powerful individual that we obviously hoping this person would actually be. So those are some of the questions that we generally just do ask in those conversations. And it's very, very important that you understand, the type of questions that are asked, because when it comes to you presenting a referee, that is not necessarily either your line manager or somebody that you report to, a supervisor, or just a colleague that might not necessarily understand the intricacies of your work. In this particular instance, they might not necessarily sell you the best way that you want them to actually do. The last thing that we sometimes do ask is, would they actually hire this individual again if they were given the opportunity? Because that's also very telling. What else do we look for? Because remember, these are the questions that we normally ask. That's what we normally want to get out of the person, or the referee, or the person that's giving you the references. What else do we look for when we actually ask these questions when it comes to the referee's response? So number one, is there genuine enthusiasm on their part when they talk about you? Are they saying what they're saying because they strongly believe that those are things that you actually are capable of? Or is it one of those where they're just doing it because they have to do it? Do they refuse to answer any of the questions about your performance or attitude? Is there something that we need to worry about in that particular instance? Because sometimes silence is actually a lot more telling. Does it feel like they're actually being over the top in that recommendation, or does it feel like they're actually being real? So you have to try and ask follow-up questions to try and check if this individual is actually covering up one or two other things. And then are they also giving only the minimal answers that we could potentially get from them? Because also, once again, you sometimes find that the lack of information that they do share is sometimes very telling about what they think about that particular individual, and we'll try and probe to try and understand if some of those things are actually, really what we think they should actually do. And does it feel like they're a bit off when it comes to some of the conversations? And that is the reason why we normally don't just speak to one individual. We sometimes speak to more than one or two other people. It's because we want to make sure that in some of those instances, we actually do check if the other person who was overly negative, if that is actually really warranted, or they're just very angry with the fact that you actually left that company. The other question that I sometimes get is, can a former employer give you a bad reference? It honestly depends. Different countries have got different laws, and different companies, for example, have got their own rules. For example, the previous company that I worked for, even though we always asked for references, we were not allowed to give references. So I couldn't give a reference while I was still employed by the company. I couldn't give a reference on an individual that worked for me. However, I could actually still ask for a reference for somebody that's coming to join my team, which, sometimes you're like, it doesn't make sense. But some companies actually stop people from doing that because they also don't want you to get into a situation where you then end up misrepresenting the company or misrepresenting the facts as they are, mainly because of how you felt about that particular individual. And then, can a previous employer disclose why you left? In most cases where it was a disciplinary and dismissal, the answer is yes, the employer can disclose why you left. If you're fired or the information does come out, you could. Once again, it depends on the company, it depends on the country, it depends on the jurisdiction, it depends on the laws of that particular environment. So some of these, remember, you might find that in your country it doesn't matter. Yes, they can disclose without even an impunity. In some cases, the way in which you disclose, it's very governed. You have to give specific references and given, so there are so many different things. So the short answer is yes, they can, and the long answer is yes, they can and they can't. And then the last thing is, are you allowed to see your references? Based on personal information and protection, whether it's GDPR, whether it's POPI, or some of these laws, the reality is you actually can ask for information on the references. You're allowed to see some of the information on the references. At the same time, however, the company still also has the right to be able to say, no, we don't feel that it's actually correct, or it's right that we actually do share that information with you. So those are some of the things that you need to be very aware of when it comes to the things that we normally ask when we ask people for references, and the kind of questions that we ask some of your referees. Top of the morning once again with Tshidi, and thank you so much for watching the video until the end, until we meet again in the next video next Tuesday. Peace.